All right, everybody, welcome back once again to Bear's Guide 205. Today we're talking about women and development. So, we've talked about how countries develop, and we've talked about HDI and the standard of living and life expectancy and literacy rate, and we've analyzed it on maps, and we're like, okay, so we get how to measure development of countries. But now we're going to look at how women play a role in the development of a country. But real quick, based on your previous knowledge, how do we develop a country, right? What what did we talk about in previous chapters that we already know walking into this unit? Pause the video for a second and think about this. Okay, so what you should have come up with is that before, and all the other units that we've talked about, the best way to develop a country is to get women involved in the country. The fact is that a lot of countries don't have equality for women. We talk about getting women out of traditional gender roles so they can join the workforce. We get them an education. That also brings down the total fertility rate. The country starts making more money, so on and so forth. These are things that we know, but now we're just putting it into, you know, more applicable situations. So the question is, where and why does inequality exist between men and women? Where do we see it in the world? What does that inequality look like? And how can we lessen it? So first off, to find inequality, first we have to figure out, can we even identify it? And that's what we use the Gender Related Development Index for. The GDI is the same thing as the HDI. But the GDI takes the same measurements of HDI, the standard of living, literacy, and life expectancy, and only applies it to women. Now, the thing about the GDI is that it's going to compare it to the HDI or both sexes. Sometimes you hear a question that'll say, like, GDI compares to what? And you don't say to men because we have no measurement of development for just men. All we have are gender development measurements for women and for women and men, because that's what HDI makes up. So try not to get these two things confused, but it is very simple and straightforward. The idea that GDI is the same thing as HDI, just only for women. But another measurement we have is the Gender Inequality Index. And this is going to measure the gender gap for three things that are specific to just women: reproductive health, empowerment, and labor market. And unlike the HDI or the GDI, we're trying to keep this number as low as possible. It is measured 0 to 1 like HDI and GDI. But instead of being closer to 1, we want to be closer to 0. And if you look at the map, you're going to see the exact same trends that you've seen in all the other maps and all the other development identifiers that you've seen. So there's no real big shock here. Now, if you're wondering what reproductive health, empowerment, and labor market look like, this is it, right? Reproductive health are those maternal mortality rates and the adolescent fertility rates. Empowerment means how many government seats of power do women have in that country, or how many women have secondary education. And then finally, labor market. How many women participate in the paid labor force over the age of 15? And you're probably wondering, well, why do we use these indicators to measure the inequality for women? Well, men have never had to fight for reproductive health. They don't have babies, so we can't track them if they die while giving birth because that's not how that works. We've never had problems with men being in government because that's how it's always been. Men have always been able to get a secondary education, and men have always been able to be part of the paid labor force. So these are unique issues just to women when we talk about inequality throughout the world. And we're going to take some time to examine each one of these things that we measure. So what is the correlation between HDI and GII according to this chart? Take a moment, pause the video, and think to yourself, this isn't a startling revelation you're going to have, but think, what is the correlation between HDI and GII? Okay, you should be coming back from pausing the video, and you probably came up with the idea, the higher your HDI, the lower your GII. Crazy idea to think that the more developed your country is, that the more equal country you will have between men and women. But everyone still has some room to grow, especially us. If you look at the United States, we're 15th in the world in HDI, but we're 42nd in GII. And that's because the US has some unique issues. The US has an incredibly high birth rate amongst teenagers, and we still are dealing with a maternal mortality rate among women during childbirth, especially women of color. We also, while we do have more women than ever in the national legislature, it's still lower compared to many other countries. So, by these traditional standards of measurement, we're still not as far as we'd like to be. Starting off with the teenage pregnancy rate, uh, for some reason in the United States, while it has gone down, we still have a very high teenage pregnancy rate compared to the rest of the developed world. And it's important because if we can drop that total fertility rate amongst teenagers, that means they have more opportunities to go to school, get a job, pursue higher education, gain skills, so on and so forth, that you just can't do if you have a kid. But what causes this is less favorable socioeconomic conditions. That means the community that you grow up in or the amount of money your family has isn't a lot. Low levels of education, low income levels amongst the teen's family, lacks of access to contraception, which we've talked a lot about with the developing world, and then, of course, the cultural stigma in our country of talking about those contraceptives. So kids end up becoming pregnant in their teenage years. Then we get the maternal mortality rate in the United States. We do, even compared to all women, we have a little bit higher of a maternal mortality rate compared to the rest of the developed world. And if we look at the women of color, they are off the charts, very comparable to the developing world even. And why is that? Once again, we're looking at less favorable socioeconomic conditions, lower levels of education, lower income levels, and lack of access to medical care. If you can't get health care, if you can't get to a hospital, if you are afraid to pay the bills that are associated with it, and you don't know if there's a problem or not, you're likely going to experience a complication. Now, where race gets involved, there have been multiple studies to show that women of color just aren't listened to doctors. I mean, women aren't listened to by doctors. But then when you factor in race, we see a disproportionate amount of women of color suffering from the maternal mortality rate in our country. And then finally, women involvement in government. And if you look at the chart, it says 75, we're in 75th place compared to some of the other countries. But then what I did too, because this is a little misleading, the top GII countries according to the UN are on the right. Notice how only two of the top GII countries are actually on this chart. So I wouldn't let it sway you so much on this one. Like, yes, we do want more women in government, but let's not use it as the only indicator of inequality in the countries, right? Because look at the other top GII countries. We're talking Switzerland, Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, Belgium, France, Iceland, and South Korea. Some of the best places to live, some of the places with the most development, the happiest people, and they don't have the most women in government either. So this just goes to show you that a lot of statistics play into this. And yeah, we might not be the best, but other countries' top GII scores aren't either. And then finally, we're going to talk about women in the paid labor force. The fact is that more and more women are involved in the paid labor around the world. We've seen the shift from subsistence agriculture to commercial agriculture or even manufacturing jobs in the developed world. The developing world. But in the developed world, we have to push more women into skilled jobs, higher tier jobs. But we find that when women try to get those jobs, they're held back from them. They don't get as many opportunities. And we've also found in the US, if women have the same exact job as men, there's generally about a 17.5% difference in pay that exists. But globally, there's a 37% difference in wages. So not only do we have the issue of trying to get more women into the workforce, we have to make sure that they're getting paid the same amount as men if it's the same work, right? It just makes sense. And why are we pushing to have so many women in the economy or so many women working? Because if you have more people working, that means more money generated for your country. That means a higher GDP or a higher GDP per capita, which means a bigger HDI score and a lower GII. And then there's some solutions in the developing world, especially when it comes to women in the paid labor force, these idea of microloans, microcredit, or microfinance. These are small loans from wealthier countries to women in poverty to start or expand a business. And these loans don't have to come from big wealthy countries like the United States. They can come from smaller, less developed, or high developing countries. It doesn't really matter, but the fact is, we have these things called NGOs, non government organizations, that are collecting money to give to women around the world as small loans to start and expand businesses. And the repayment rate for these really poor communities is a whopping 98%. So it seems to be working, right? And remember, when women can go from subsistence agriculture to buying things for a farm to start making some money, they can take that money, they can send their kids to school, they can hire workers. They also have to change laws to be able to own land and so on and so forth, but we're moving the countries forward towards a higher HDI score, a GDI score, and a lower GII score. So, okay, things you must be able to understand, and you're going to want to write these answers in your notebook. First, you have to identify the differences between HDI, GDI, and GII. Okay? Very simple, straightforward question. And remember, try not to look at your notes either when doing these. Then describe how countries can lower their GII. Okay? Think about specifically the components of GII and how they can lower them. Explain how lowering GII can help increase a country's HDI. And then finally, the big question, discuss what you think is the best way to measure female development, GDI or GII. Okay, so that's it for this one. Shorter PowerPoint. We went through it a lot faster. Make sure you get this stuff in your notebook so we're ready for our exciting Monday. And always, this is Barrett's Guide to a 5. Make sure you hit like on the YouTube video, hit subscribe, hit the bell so you get notifications when new videos come out because we're always excited for new ones. And I'll see you next time.